My name is Caitlin McConnell, and I'm here today with Crockett Oaks III, a generational resident of Howell County and whose family has long been involved in caretaking the Sadie Brown Cemetery, a historical black cemetery near West Plains. Today, Crockett and I will speak about his efforts to restore the cemetery and its place in local black history. This interview is part of Buried History, an oral history project between Ozarks Alive and Missouri State University Libraries that focuses on death and burial traditions in the Ozarks. Today's date is October 29th, 2024, and we are speaking at Crockett's office in Kellett Hall on the Missouri State University West Plains campus, where he serves as Associate Vice Chancellor of Business Support Services. Thank you for letting me come visit with you today.
You are welcome, and thank you for having interest.
Well, I'm excited to get to have this history in one place and for people to be able to learn more about the cemetery and kind of maybe we just start there with can you kind of give us an overview of the history of the cemetery as we know it now?
Sure. So Sadie Brown Cemetery, the best we can determine, was established in the mid-1800s. It was established by the earliest African-American settlers here in Howell County, out in the Dried Creek Township area, which is essentially North 63rd, Highway 63 and Highway 14. It was, before it was known as the Sadie Brown Cemetery, it was just a common burial location that the African Americans used in the area. And then St. Leger Brown, through a homestead act, awarding of a homestead under the Harrison presidency around 1890, he inherited received 80,000.
It was 80 acres.
Yeah, it was 80 acres. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
Yeah, it was 80 acres that he received in the area, which also included that cemetery. He and his wife Sarah continued to use that spot as a burial ground.
Just to clarify for anybody listening, so St. Leger is Sadie. Like Sadie is the nickname for St. Leger?
So it's interesting. The land was owned by St. Leger Brown and his wife Sarah. The nickname for Sarah is Sadie. And so it was known as the Brown Cemetery. Then Sarah, after St. Leger passed away, continued to use the plot of ground as a cemetery. So we believe that it wasn't formally named the Sadie Brown Cemetery. It was just people making reference to the fact that they were going to be buried in Sadie Brown's cemetery.
Okay.
I.e. possession, Sadie Brown's cemetery.
Okay.
And so that's how we believe the name came about, but it was owned by St. Leger Brown.
And so just thinking on the timeline too, what is the best estimate as to when the first burials would have happened? That, I mean, late 1800s.
It was around the 1880s.
Okay.
Best we can determine, that would have been just a few years past the Civil War.
Okay.
And it would have been literally the earliest black settlers to Howell County, some of which came as enslaved individuals. And so, yeah, the earliest settlers were enslaved and they were interned at Sadie Brown.
I mean, this kind of going off on a tangent that we don't need to go down necessarily, but just setting the stage a little bit for people who may not be familiar with Howell County or this area. What has there been historically a large black population here? I mean, did people stay after slavery and the Civil War was over, or were those more people who moved in, in subsequent years?
Sure. At the turn of the century, census records supported that there was a larger number of African Americans in Howell County. They were here primarily to work on farms or fruit orchards, as well as for the railroad, laying railroad ties from the expansion of the railroad in this area. And so we see, and based on a photo that we have from Lincoln School archives, a sizable number of African Americans. It wasn't until 1903 that we see the population slowly shrinking. There was a threat that came to the black community in 1903 that basically threatened violence if they didn't leave the area, and consequently, based on publications during the time, a lot of the African Americans left. And then census records support each year of the census, the numbers kept dwindling. So I think at the height of, 19th century, at the height of that period, there was probably 75 to 100 African American families here in Howell County. And today we're fewer than probably 100 individuals.
So it's a big decrease compared to the past.
Significant.
And through all of this time, the Sadie Brown Cemetery has been in use pretty much ever since late 1800s.
It's been in use the whole time.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, it didn't make the U.S. geospatial maps until the 80s, the 1980s, which we found very interesting. MSU research through Center of Archaeological Research was able to show us when it was added, that plot of land was added on the maps and identified as a cemetery.
Wow.
But it had been in use for, at that point, over 100 years.
Wow.
Active use.
Wow. I mean, maybe this is a good time too. Can you talk a little bit about how your family got here and got connected with the cemetery?
Sure. My family migrated up from Arkansas during the Great Migration of African Americans to the north. So shortly after the turn of the century, my great-grandmother and her family, inclusive of my grandfather as a little boy, migrated to West Plains from the Lawrence County, Imboden, Ravenden area of Arkansas. And we've been here ever since. So we got involved with the cemetery, to follow up with your question, we got involved with the cemetery and say ever since we've been here, when somebody passed away, they were interred at Sadie Brown, but we actively got involved with the caretaking of the cemetery in the 1970s. My father took over the responsibility for my grandparents. So
your grandfather had also been involved.
He had been. He was one of the men that dug graves whenever someone within the African American community passed away. Back then they didn't have backhoes and things of that sort, so it was just men that would work during the day and in the evening, and sometimes even at night with lanterns. My father talks about going out there with his dad, digging graves in preparation for a funeral that was going to take place. And so, since the 1970s, the Oakses have been a part of the infrastructure of the cemetery.
Well, and from your perspective, when you were growing up here, how commonly, were you thinking about the cemetery? Was it mainly if somebody died and you went to the funeral, or was it because of your dad and your grandfather, something that was pretty significant on your radar?
So we would go out, Caitlin, there whenever they had cemetery cleanup day. My brother and I, parents, as well as other African Americans within the community, would go out there and try to clean the cemetery up at least once a year as a community. And so I would think about the cemetery then. I think about, with kind of a smile on my face and sorrow in my heart, how we used to collect the rocks and the big boulders out there at the cemetery so that they could mow and weed eat around the grave sites. Little did we know at the time we were actually carrying out headstones. For the cemetery. You see back then African Americans wouldn't have had money to purchase headstones, so either they made crude headstones out of cement and then would engrave something in there, or use sticks and boulders to denote where the grave was of a loved one was at.
I remember us talking at one point about how when you were in high school, you did a video about the cemetery's history, which I found so cool because, like, even then, clearly you saw this as something that was important. Do you remember how you decided back then that, or was it just that you were a high schooler and this seemed like a good, thing to talk about?
Well, truth in lending, Jim Decker, he was over the Ridge Runner
Publication?
Publication at the time, and he asked me if I would go out and do some filming at the Sadie Brown Cemetery and provide my perspective and knowledge on the cemetery and some of those that are interred there. And so, that's how Crockett Oaks filming the Sadie Brown Cemetery as a junior in high school, I guess back in 1987, was born. Didn't know much about filming back then, but my frame of reference was MTV Raps, Fab Five Freddy on the scene, so I went out there and did it like Fab Five Freddy would have. And I can't believe that video still looms and haunts me to this very day.
Well, and I think the other thing that was interesting to me as someone who studies history, myself, that the information we have changes over time sometimes. It's like, I remember you talking about how some of the information you thought was true back then wasn't at all the case, and there had to be further research to figure things out.
That's exactly right. So everyone was under the impression that the Sadie Brown Cemetery was named after a lady named Sadie Brown. And that the land was appointed to her from a white family that gave her the land to be used as a cemetery for the African American community. It actually is a story that's more complex than that, because it was through the Homestead Act that her husband was appointed 80 acres that included the existing cemetery that they just continued to use as a cemetery. And so I think that the African American community, many of which at the time was probably illiterate, couldn't read and write for themselves. And so they would take those stories that were just basically passed down, and then you repeat a story long enough and long enough and hard enough, I guess it becomes realistic, even though it's not reality. And so through Center for Archaeological Research, as well as independent research of my own and that of others, we were able to uncover the reality of how the cemetery came into being and how the Brown family was appointed that land.
So kind of doing a quick fast forward from you said 87, 88 into about 2021. So, as you talked about, like, the African American community's numbers continued to decline. Like, how often was the cemetery being used? I mean, was it like once a year, or less than once a year?
That's a great question. Actually, the last burial that has taken place at Sadie Brown Cemetery was in 2017.
Okay.
And that was my Aunt Merle Menard that passed away. It was no real set period of frequency. It was just based on someone within the African American community that passed away and chose to be buried there. I'd say prior to 2017, the last burial would have been maybe 10 years prior. And so very infrequent, but the cemetery was always maintained, at least mowed a few times a year, and during key holidays and dates of remembrance, people would go out there and place flowers on love stones, tombstones. So I would say, although there wasn't active burials because there wasn't a big population of those that passed away, it was still actively cared for and actively used as a point of remembrance for the community.
Well, and so so readers understand the context a little bit, you moved away.
I did.
And then it was 20, you said 20, you gave me the date and I've already forgotten. We said 2018, 2019, 2020.
Yeah, I came back in 2020.
Okay. So how did you decide to take this on as a project when you came back?
So my father has been the caretaker of the cemetery since since the 1970s, and he has fallen into poor health over the years, and someone needed to kind of step in and think about the future of the cemetery. The issue that we had with Sadie Brown the Sadie Brown Cemetery was that we didn't know exactly where the graves were at within the cemetery because of the lack of markings and the lack of headstones. And so we needed to partner with Missouri State University's Center for Archaeological Research, Kevin Kupta-Head, to help us to identify where the graves are at, and then be able to properly mark those grave sites so that we could prepare it for future use. So we had done an okay job of maintaining the physical appearance of the cemetery, but it wasn't really set for good future use because of this inability to identify plots. We knew that there was a lot of unmarked graves there, but when the number came back as high as it was, it really helped us to understand the scale of the need that we had. We had a need, but we didn't realize how badly that need was until they came back and said there's, they suspect that there's over 100 unmarked graves out there. 79 were marked and the rest were unmarked.
When you moved back, was there I know obviously the progression from your dad was the main reason that you, I guess, started actively getting more involved, but was there kind of like a catalyst moment where it's like, this needs to be recognized better than it is? These people deserve more, or whatever the thought process was you had.
Yeah. There was kind of a defining moment in my mind that made me want to step up and ensure that proper representation of the earliest settlers of our community was known and recognized. And it was, when I got back, very active in the community, and going to a number of presentations around town about the history and formation of West Plains. I just noticed that there wasn't much of a ode to the African American community, despite my clear understanding that we have always been here, and what has been accomplished and achieved from those earliest ancestors. And I didn't see it really being commemorated in anything visually, as well as even in storytelling. And I saw a lot of the things that we took for granted as key institutions within our community being just kind of evaporating, withering away, not being properly cared for, not being properly funded. And so, one day I was lamenting to my wife about this feeling that I had that I needed to do something. It wasn't that I really had a burning desire early on. It was just that I saw a need, and I knew that in looking around, no one else was going to do it. It had to be me.
Well, and once that happened, I know you applied for some grant funding to help. And so that helped, it fueled the radar, or was that part of the because I know that that part was done, there were some markers placed, right? What was the kind of the picture of everything that's happened there since?
So, MSU, Center for Archaeological Research, came in, they did their work, they did a lot of research, they helped us to identify where they were at, where the unmarked graves were at. We then got a grant from Community Foundation of the Ozarks, excellent organization. They gave us $20,000 that we used to purchase headstones to mark those graves, as well as 3 seats, 3 benches that are out there now that will afford ancestors visiting the cemetery a place to sit and reflect. And so I think just the raising of awareness of who's interred at Sadie Brown Cemetery, has meant the world to its trajectory. And I'm very proud to have had, something to do with that. And I feel comfortable that, well past me, the cemetery won't fall into disrepair. I think now that people are clearly aware of its history and its significance in our collective community, it will be well provided for and taken care of for the foreseeable future.
Well, there's a point on that I want to come back to in just a second, but I think it's important, meaningful to note too that I know, like when I've been out there, and I think I understand this correctly, the graves that we didn't know specifically who it was, what their name, there are Bible verses, there are inspirational sayings that are kind of on the stone instead of their name, right?
Yes.
I think that, I would be curious as to how the idea for that came about, because I really think that's important. And it reminds us that it's really sad that we don't know who this was, that should have been more front of mind for the past, for people. But anyway, don't mean to go off on a tangent there, but was that something you'd seen done elsewhere, or did you guys just have the idea to do that sort of commemoration that way?
No, I did confer with, family members to seek their input for scriptures, but we just thought out of necessity, if we couldn't identify who was exactly buried in locations, then we had to have something to go on the headstones that was profound and meaningful. And there's nothing more profound and meaningful, in my estimation, than to read a comforting Bible scripture that would help loved ones that may not know where ancestors are actually interred, but to walk the cemetery proper and read those scriptures can bring a sense of comfort in knowing that loved one is there, and it is a place of spiritual being. Now, another aspect of why I thought it was important to do what we did for the cemetery was to give family members, not least my parents, the confidence to be buried there, that something positive was going to happen for the cemetery that would ensure that their gravesite was remembered and taken care of. And so I think just through that pure effort of cleanup and identification gives them the comfort that they need to have faith to be buried there.
I remember in the past when we talked about this, you mentioned there had been some community work days, and this had involved a few other organizations through the applying for the grant and things like that. What do you think that this has meant for the community, having this brought to the forefront of the conversation?
Yeah, that's another excellent question. The conversations that I've had with the community about the work there and their contribution, whether it be physical or monetary contribution to the cemetery, is very supportive and very collaborative. I don't think that people saw their history reflected in the Sadie Brown Cemetery if you aren't African American. But through those storytelling and helping to illuminate the identities of those interred there and how they're connected to descendants of family members still in our community was powerful. Case in point, this individual interred at Sadie Brown Cemetery, worked as a domestic for the grandmother of a community member, and the grandmother spoke so fondly of that person, but after the person passed away, there was no clear understanding of where to go to pay respect to that person that may have even helped to raise a child within that family through their domestic service. And so I just think that the community responded very positively to being confronted with the reality of its near erasure and the need to do something.
Well, and that kind of circles back to one other thing I wanted to ask about was, you mentioned coming here and kind of seeing the absence, I guess, or the disappearance of historically African American spaces in town and things like that. Do you want to talk at all about Lincoln School? Because I think that sort of ties in with this too.
I do.
Okay.
And that was one of the battle cries that we launched with regard to the Lincoln School effort. You can't stop with just Sadie Brown Cemetery. They went to school at Lincoln School, they lived in our community, and they died and was interred at Sadie Brown Cemetery. So it's kind of a continuum story that just needs to be told, and in order to feel proud about telling that story, you have to talk about what has been done with the old schoolhouse. And so I must say that in 2021, there was an effort by a local community organizer in Carol Sylvie that raised the awareness a bit about Lincoln School. She organized through a group that she was facilitating called the Young Vision Group. She organized a paint day where Lincoln School was actually painted. Now, it was an old building that needed a lot more work besides painting, but she done the good job of at least raising the awareness in my mind and in the community's mind that this is a space that's more than its current purpose. It was the home of Alcoholics Anonymous at the time, but what she did through that effort, however small it may have been, was raise the awareness, which was large and huge, at least in my mind, because it was that effort that made me stand up and say, you know what, more needs to be done. This is good, this is an interim step, but more needs to be done to save this historic space. And then when I look back and think about nationally what is taking place with old one-room schoolhouses that were segregation era, there is a groundswell of support, grant money out there, and community involvement to save these spaces. And we had one in our backyard, no pun intended, literally one in our backyard that was just there and still standing and not really being acknowledged for the history that it shared.
And for anyone listening, there's been an amazing story unfold since that time, really over the last year and I guess the grand opening will be a year in January 25.
Yes.
And so,
Yes.
but a couple years now, once you were ready to kick off the project.
Yes.
You want to talk about what it's doing?
I do. It's my happy spot. We bought Lincoln School from the city in July 2023, July the 28th, 2023 to be exact. We started restoration of that historic space in August the 4th of 2023, and by January the 25th of 2024, we had completed the restoration and held the dedication of that space. The community's response, I think, was really kind of informed greatly by Sadie Brown Cemetery efforts too. So we raised the awareness of the African American community, and through that effort, storytelling ensued about who used to work for whom and what this person meant to the community, and et cetera, and then it just migrated over to our efforts with Lincoln School, and the storytelling continued, and it hasn't stopped. And so we were able to receive yet another grant from Community Foundation of the Ozarks, who I can't express enough gratitude for what they saw and believed in through our efforts, and was willing to financially support it, as well as just West Plains Bank was another entity that gave us money early on, DRS, it goes on, and numerous entities within our community, Carrie Stewart Construction. I probably shouldn't have started naming a few because there's so many to name, and I don't want to leave out anyone. But we received a groundswell of support from individuals and entities that rallied around our efforts, and it hasn't stopped. And so we're done with the restoration. We have great programming designed to continue to tell stories, share history, new history, and not least help everyone to feel included and seen within our community. So we do a number of African American oriented programming, but that's not to build knowledge of the subject within ourselves. That's to share that knowledge with the community, so that through that sharing there can be, just a shared sense of pride and responsibility.
This has been amazing. Is there anything that you haven't mentioned or I didn't ask that you want to talk about with regards to this interview?
Yeah, thank you for the follow-up. We are not done with Lincoln School because we feel that there needs to be more of a grounding of its history that everyone will be able to take pride and share in. And it's hence why we've found it necessary to start constructing Reflection Plaza. Reflection Plaza is going to be an area on the grounds of Lincoln School that has 2 bronze sculptures, some seats, some setting areas, and maybe some monuments and words of encouragement and some acknowledgement of history that allows for our community to enter into that space and do exactly what the name implies. Reflect upon our past, reflect upon the future, and bring us closer together through that effort.
Wow. Well, I can't wait to see what happens with that. It's amazing, and it's amazing to hear about it, and it's just very inspirational to listen to you talk about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your willingness to just talk with us about it and stay on board with helping us to communicate the stories of our ancestors.